January 30, 1945. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima clings to everything. Morning light breaks reluctantly over the island's blackened beaches, revealing a landscape sculpted by violence, twisted metal, shattered palm stumps, and the acrid smell of sulfur mixing with cordite. Across the terraced ridges, 16 Japanese bunkers sit embedded in the volcanic rock like malignant growths, their firing ports watching every approach with patient malevolence. The Marines who landed here know these fortifications are not merely obstacles. They are crypts designed to consume American lives by the dozen. Inside one of these positions, Japanese gunners wait in the darkness, fingers resting on triggers, breathing the stale air of men who have already accepted death. They have been told the Americans are soft, that they will break under sustained fire, that their individualism makes them weak in the face of collective sacrifice. They believe this. They have seen Marines falter before. But on this morning, as the sun climbs higher and the heat begins its daily assault, none of these soldiers can see the figure moving through the volcanic debris below. A single Marine, dragging a weapon designed for 2 men, about to shatter every assumption they hold about American resolve. To understand what happens next, one must first understand the weapon. The M2 Browning, often called the Ma Deuce, weighed 84 pounds without its tripod and another 44 with it. It fired 50 caliber rounds, bullets half an inch in diameter, each one weighing over an ounce and traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. These rounds could punch through concrete, shred engine blocks, and turn human bodies into vapor. The weapon was designed with a crew in mind. 1 man to fire, another to feed ammunition, a third to spot targets and adjust fire. This was not arrogance or inefficiency. This was physics. The recoil alone could break ribs. The barrel grew hot enough to ignite cloth after sustained firing. The ammunition belts were heavy, cumbersome, requiring constant attention to prevent jams. No manual suggested a single operator. No training protocol prepared anyone to employ this weapon alone. And yet, on the northern slopes of Iwo Jima, a Marine whose name would later echo through military history made a decision that defied every tactical doctrine, every ergonomic principle, every reasonable assessment of human capability. The Pacific War had been teaching lessons in brutality since December 1941. Island by island, the Americans pushed westward, learning with each landing that the Japanese did not fight wars. They waged campaigns of annihilation where surrender was apostasy and death was sacrament. At Tarawa, the Marines encountered bunkers built from coconut logs and reinforced concrete that withstood naval bombardment. At Peleliu, they discovered cave systems that turned entire ridges into labyrinths of death. But Iwo Jima represented something beyond tactical sophistication. Here, the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Tarawa, had abandoned the suicidal beach charges that characterized earlier battles. Instead, he constructed a defense in depth, a network of tunnels, artillery positions, and mutually supporting bunkers designed not to win, but to exact such a horrific price that America would negotiate peace rather than invade the home islands. 21,000 Japanese soldiers occupied this 8-square-mile island. They had months to prepare. They knew the Americans were coming. They welcomed it. The Marine who approached those 16 bunkers on January 30 understood this calculation. He had seen friends obliterated by artillery they never saw fired from positions they could not locate. He had watched men burn alive from flamethrowers turned against their own wielders by hidden snipers. He knew that conventional tactics, suppressing fire, coordinated assaults, tank support, would take hours and cost lives measured in double digits. The bunkers formed an interlocking network where advancing on one exposed attackers to crossfire from 3 others. Japanese engineers had positioned them with geometric precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that transformed the approach into a killing corridor. American doctrine called for methodical reduction. Artillery preparation, aerial bombardment, infantry probing attacks, engineers with explosives. This process was thorough, tested, and glacially slow. And this Marine, looking at those 16 positions and calculating the casualties conventional tactics would inflict on his brothers, made a different choice. He began with the tripod, the 44-pound steel cradle designed to stabilize the M2 during sustained fire. He dragged it forward alone, muscles screaming protest, volcanic ash providing treacherous footing on the slope. The Japanese spotted him quickly. How could they not? A single figure, moving with suicidal audacity into their engagement zone, hauling equipment no man should carry alone. The first shots came from the nearest bunker, rifle fire that cracked through the morning air and kicked up small explosions of black sand around his boots. He did not retreat. He did not call for support. He positioned the tripod, locked it into the volcanic soil, and returned for the gun. 84 pounds of machined steel, still hot from previous engagements, its barrel already marked by the scars of combat. He lifted it, felt his spine compress under the weight, and moved forward again. More fire now from multiple positions, the Japanese gunners adjusting their aim, recognizing that this lone American represented not a scout or a forward observer, but something far more dangerous, a man who had stopped calculating odds. The assembly took 40 seconds. Under fire, with bullets impacting close enough to shower him with debris, he mated the weapon to its mount, checked the headspace with practiced fingers, and loaded the first belt. 50 rounds, linked metal cartridges that gleamed dully in the volcanic haze. The M2 Browning was a mechanical symphony, a weapon designed during the First World War and perfected through 2 decades of refinement. Its operation was brilliantly simple, short recoil operation, where the barrel and bolt recoiled together before separating, the bolt cycling back to strip a new round from the belt, chamber it, and fire again at a rate of 600 rounds per minute. But simplicity in design did not mean simplicity in operation. The weapon demanded respect, attention, and constant monitoring. Feed angle, belt tension, barrel temperature, each variable could transform the M2 from devastating instrument to jammed liability in seconds. And this Marine was about to operate it without a crew, without support, without anyone to warn him if the barrel began to glow cherry red, or if enemy fire was converging on his position. The first burst lasted 3 seconds. 18 rounds left the barrel, traveling downrange at velocities that turned air into a visible shockwave. The nearest bunker, reinforced with volcanic stone and concrete, its firing port calculated to provide maximum coverage while minimizing exposure, disappeared in a cloud of pulverized rock and shattered wood. The 50 caliber rounds, each carrying kinetic energy equivalent to a small artillery shell, punched through the fortification's face with contemptuous ease. Inside, Japanese soldiers who had expected to spend the day methodically killing exposed Marines experienced the sudden, horrifying revelation of walls becoming shrapnel, of darkness flooding with daylight through holes that should not exist, of their impregnable fortress rendered instantly obsolete. Those who survived the initial burst scattered deeper into the bunker complex, shouting warnings that spread through the tunnel network like electric current, warnings about an American with a heavy machine gun, alone, destroying positions faster than seemed physically possible. But physical possibility was being redefined in real time on that volcanic slope. The Marines shifted fire to the second bunker, this one elevated and offset, designed to provide enfilade fire against anyone attacking the first position. He did not wait for it to engage. He did not suppress and maneuver. He simply directed the M2's muzzle toward the firing port and held the trigger. The weapon roared, its distinctive heavy chatter, slower and deeper than the M1919. 30 caliber guns the infantry carried, announcing that something fundamental had changed on this battlefield. The second bunker's firing port erupted in sparks as rounds impacted, ricocheted, and penetrated. Wood splintered. Stone cracked. And then, critically, something inside caught fire. Perhaps ammunition, perhaps fuel for lamps, perhaps nothing more than dry wood and desperate men. The cause became irrelevant as smoke began pouring from the position, thick and black, carrying with it the smell that every combat veteran knows and never forgets. 3 minutes had elapsed. 2 bunkers neutralized. The Marine's shoulders burned from absorbing recoil. His ears rang despite the combat plugs. The M2's muzzle blast at close proximity was a physical force that rattled teeth and compressed lungs. Sweat soaked his utilities, mixing with volcanic ash to form a gray paste on exposed skin. And the ammunition belt was running low, which meant the most vulnerable moment in this insane solo operation: reloading. He dropped behind the weapon's bulk, using its steel frame and tripod as minimal cover, and reached for the second belt. His hands moved with automatic precision born from countless training repetitions: open feed tray cover, position belt, close cover, charge weapon. 10 seconds. 10 seconds of exposure, of vulnerability, of gambling that the Japanese gunners in the remaining 14 bunkers would be shocked enough, confused enough, demoralized enough not to concentrate fire on his position. The gamble paid. He resumed firing. The Japanese soldiers watching from deeper positions faced a psychological crisis that transcended tactical concerns. Their doctrine, their training, their entire cultural framework for understanding warfare emphasized collective strength, coordinated defense, and the spiritual superiority of men willing to die for emperor and nation. And here, destroying their carefully constructed fortifications with methodical precision, was a single American who had apparently decided that doctrine and probability were suggestions he chose to ignore. They had been told Americans were individualists who crumbled without support, who needed overwhelming material superiority to compensate for spiritual weakness. They had been assured that bunkers like theirs, built according to German engineering principles, reinforced with volcanic stone, positioned for mutual support, could withstand anything short of sustained naval bombardment. And they were watching those assurances disintegrate under the fire of one man, with a weapon he should not be able to operate alone. Bunkers 3 and 4 fell within 90 seconds of each other. The Marine had identified the network's geometry now, understood which positions supported which others, recognized the pattern in their placement. He targeted them not in sequence but in tactical priority, destroying positions in an order calculated to collapse the defensive network's integrity. This was not berserker fury. This was cold, tactical brilliance executed under conditions that would paralyze most men. Each burst was measured, long enough to devastate the target, short enough to conserve ammunition and prevent barrel overheating. Between bursts, he shifted position. Slightly, never remaining static, preventing the remaining Japanese gunners from establishing accurate ranging. The M2's tripod left drag marks in the volcanic ash, a trail documenting his methodical advance up the slope toward positions that commanded the high ground. 15 minutes into the engagement, 8 bunkers had been neutralized or destroyed. The Marine had fired over 800 rounds, gone through multiple ammunition belts, and absorbed recoil equivalent to being repeatedly struck in the shoulder with a wooden beam. His utility uniform hung in tatters where the weapon's moving parts had caught fabric during reloading. Blood seeped from abrasions where hot brass had contacted skin, and he continued firing. The Japanese commander in this sector, watching through a periscope from a deeper position, later wrote in his diary, recovered after the battle about this moment: "A demon has come to our position, not an army, not a squad. One man with a terrible weapon, moving as if he does not fear death because he has already accepted it. I ordered concentration of fire." The demon continued. The concentration of fire came from the remaining 8 bunkers, a coordinated volley designed to suppress and destroy this impossible threat. Rifle rounds, machine gun bursts, even a few grenades launched from Type 89 grenade dischargers converged on the Marines' position. Volcanic rock exploded into fragments. The air filled with the whine of ricochets and the crack of near misses. And the Marine dropped flat, using the M2 itself as cover, waiting for the fusillade to slacken, then rose and resumed firing. This cycle repeated: concentrated enemy fire, brief cover, renewed assault, with a rhythm that suggested either supreme confidence or complete dissociation from normal survival instinct. Perhaps both. Combat, particularly combat of this intensity and duration, creates altered states of consciousness where time dilates, where fear transmutes into something colder and more functional, where the body continues operating after the mind has retreated to some protected core. Bunker 9 sat at the network's center, a larger structure reinforced with steel rails scavenged from a pre-war mining operation. Its walls were thicker, its firing ports narrower, its position calculated to command approaches from 3 directions. The Marine studied it for perhaps 10 seconds, noting angles and construction, then did something that the Japanese commander's diary describes as beyond comprehension. He lifted the M2 from its tripod. 84 pounds of weapon, its barrel now hot enough to raise blisters on contact, its mechanism cycling rounds at 600 per minute. He lifted it, tucked it against his hip in a position toward Bunker 9. The recoil should have knocked him backward. The barrel's heat should have made sustained grip impossible. The weapon's weight should have made accurate fire from a hip-supported stance absurd. And yet, for 15 seconds, an eternity in combat, he walked forward firing continuous bursts into the bunker's firing ports, his body absorbing and channeling forces that should have overwhelmed any individual's capacity to control. The Japanese soldiers in Bunker 9 experienced those 15 seconds as the collapse of reality. Rounds punched through their reinforced walls as if they were paper. The darkness of their position filled with spinning fragments of steel and stone. Men died without understanding what killed them, their last thoughts perhaps returning to villages they would never see again, to families who would receive only terse notifications of honorable death in service to the emperor. And then the Marine stopped, lowered the weapon back to his tripod, and methodically reloaded. His hands shook now, not from fear but from sheer physical exhaustion, from muscles pushed beyond their rated capacity, from a body running on adrenaline and willpower in equal measure. 23 minutes, 11 bunkers silenced or destroyed. The remaining 5 sat higher on the slope, positioned where terrain made conventional assault nearly suicidal. They had been the Japanese commander's reserve positions, designed to pour fire down on any force that successfully breached the lower defenses. Their crews watched the lone Marine below, understanding now that they faced not a conventional assault but something unprecedented. Some accounts suggest that several Japanese soldiers in these positions attempted to retreat deeper into the tunnel complex rather than face this singular threat. Command officers prevented this, brandishing sidearms, invoking honor and duty. The soldiers remained at their posts. They had been trained to die for emperor and nation. But training, however rigorous, however infused with spiritual certainty, cannot fully prepare men for the reality of watching carefully constructed defenses obliterated by an enemy who operates outside all known parameters. The Marine shifted his approach for these final positions. The angle was wrong for direct fire. The bunkers sat too high, too well protected by terrain. So he began a lateral movement, dragging the M2 and its tripod across the slope, paralleling the Japanese positions rather than advancing directly toward them. This maneuver exposed him to enfilade fire from multiple positions, created longer sight lines for enemy gunners, and violated every principle of approaching fortified positions. It was also tactically brilliant. By moving laterally, he changed the engagement geometry, transforming positions designed to resist frontal assault into targets exposed in profile. The first of these upper bunkers had thick walls facing downslope, but thinner construction on its flank, designed for ventilation and auxiliary entrance. The Marine identified this vulnerability from 50 yards away and exploited it with brutal efficiency. A sustained burst, 40 rounds in 6 seconds, through the auxiliary entrance. The bunker's interior volume, filled with explosive overpressure, heat, and fragmenting metal, became unsurvivable. 27 minutes, 12 bunkers. The Marines' water supply, 2 canteens carried into this engagement, was exhausted. Dehydration under combat conditions accelerates catastrophically in volcanic terrain where ambient temperature combines with physical exertion and adrenaline to drain fluid reserves with brutal efficiency. His lips cracked. His tongue felt thick, clumsy, and he continued. Bunker 13 sat partially collapsed from earlier naval bombardment, its garrison operating from a position compromised by structural damage, but still capable of delivering lethal fire. The Marine gave it a single burst, conserving ammunition now, recognizing that his remaining belts numbered 3, that each round must count, that profligacy would leave him defenseless against the final positions. The burst entered through the collapsed section, found the bunker's interior, and produced the distinctive secondary explosion that indicated ammunition stores ignited. Japanese doctrine called for storing ammunition within fighting positions for sustained defense. This doctrine, sound in principle, became catastrophic when incendiary. 50 caliber rounds found those stores and transformed defensive positions into funeral pyres. Bunker 14 required a different approach. It sat in dead ground, a depression that made direct fire impossible from the Marines' current position. He could bypass it, leave it for follow-on forces, continue his assault on the remaining positions. But bypassing a functional enemy strongpoint violated every instinct, every tactical lesson learned through blood across the Pacific. So he advanced directly toward it, closing to within 20 yards, a range where Japanese defenders could employ grenades, where small arms fire became devastatingly accurate, where the psychological advantage of distance and standoff disappeared. And at 20 yards, in full view of the bunker's garrison, he set up the M2, loaded a fresh belt, and destroyed the position with methodical, close-range fire. The Japanese soldiers inside faced a choice: remain in a bunker being systematically demolished around them, or flee into open ground where the M2 could track and engage them. They chose honor. They remained. They died. 29 minutes, 14 bunkers, 2 remained. The final positions sat adjacent to each other, designed for mutual support, their fields of fire overlapping to create a kill zone that any conventional assault would have to cross. The Marine studied them through eyes burning with ash and sweat, through a fatigue that made simple thought difficult, through the growing realization that his body was approaching failure. His shoulders were masses of bruising from recoil absorption. His hands bled from abrasions against hot metal. His legs trembled with each step. And yet, when he moved toward those final 2 bunkers, his pace was steady, his handling of the M2 precise, his tactical thinking clear. He had transcended normal physical limits through a combination of training, will, and something harder to quantify. Perhaps the accumulated rage of watching friends die in previous engagements. Perhaps a cold calculation that these bunkers represented Japanese soldiers who would kill more Marines if allowed to survive. Perhaps nothing more complex than a job requiring completion, and a man unwilling to leave it unfinished. The penultimate bunker fell to a flanking approach, the Marine using a volcanic outcropping as cover during his final movement, then emerging at an angle the bunker's construction had not anticipated. 30 seconds of sustained fire. The firing port transformed from defensive advantage to fatal vulnerability as 50 caliber rounds entered and ricocheted through the interior, turning the bunker's walls into additional weapons through spalling and fragmentation. And then there was one. The final bunker sat at the network's highest point, commanding views of the entire slope, its garrison having watched the previous 30 minutes with growing horror. They knew their turn was coming. They knew, with certainty approaching religious conviction, that no defense they could mount would matter against the approaching figure and his terrible weapon. Some accounts suggest they attempted surrender. White cloth pushed through the firing port, the international signal of capitulation. But in the chaos, and at that distance, with visibility obscured by smoke and volcanic haze, such signals could not register. Or perhaps the Marine saw them, and after 30 minutes of sustained combat, after watching defensive positions kill uncounted numbers of his fellow Marines in previous engagements, decided that surrender was a privilege this particular bunker had forfeited. History preserves no certain answer, only the outcome. A final sustained burst, 200 rounds in rapid succession, the M2's barrel glowing visible red even in daylight, the last bunker's structural integrity failing under impacts that exceeded its engineering specifications by orders of magnitude. "30 minutes and 15 seconds after beginning his assault, the Marine stopped firing. 16 bunkers, positions designed to hold against company-strength assaults, fortifications that represented months of engineering effort and the best defensive thinking the Imperial Japanese Army could muster, had been neutralized or destroyed by one man with a crew-served weapon, employed in a manner no manual suggested and no training anticipated. He stood behind the M2, hands still gripping its spade handles, body swaying slightly from exhaustion and dehydration. Around him, volcanic ash drifted through the morning air, settling on destroyed fortifications, obscuring the dead, coating everything in a fine gray powder that erased distinctions and reduced the complex violence of combat to monochrome stillness. Other Marines, pinned down by this bunker network for hours, began advancing up the slope, disbelief evident in their movements, their weapons tracking for threats that no longer existed. The weapon before him, the M2 Browning, would continue its service for decades beyond this engagement. It would fire in Korea, in Vietnam, in deserts and jungles and urban terrain across every subsequent conflict. It would earn designation as the longest-serving weapon in American military inventory, a mechanical achievement that transcended its era through elegant design and brutal effectiveness. But on this morning, on this volcanic slope on Iwo Jima, it was something more than a weapon. It was proof of a specific proposition, that American industrial capacity, combined with individual initiative and training that emphasized adaptability over rigid doctrine, could overcome defensive preparations that assumed conventional tactics and collective action. The Japanese had built their defense on calculations about what was possible, what was reasonable, what adversaries could accomplish within recognized parameters. The Marine with the M2 had simply rejected those parameters as constraints rather than accepting them as limits. In Tokyo, where leaders still clung to the belief that American resolve would crack under sufficient casualties, where strategic planning assumed that Iwo Jima would cost so many lives that invasion of the home islands would become politically impossible. This engagement represented data that contradicted cherished assumptions. One Marine had eliminated 16 bunkers in half an hour. One man, operating outside doctrinal norms, achieving results that required company-strength forces by conventional calculation. If this was replicable, if American training and culture produced soldiers capable of such individual effectiveness, then every calculation about relative strength, about the exchange rates necessary to make invasion prohibitively costly, became suspect. The battle for Iwo Jima would ultimately cost nearly 7,000 American lives and result in over 20,000 Japanese deaths. It would consume 36 days of brutal fighting, demonstration of what individual excellence armed with superior technology could accomplish, suggested a truth that Japanese strategic planning had not adequately considered. American military strength derived not merely from material abundance, but from a culture that trained individuals to think, adapt, and exceed recognized limits when circumstances demanded. The Marine was evacuated that afternoon, carried from the field by corpsmen who treated his injuries. Severe dehydration, second-degree burns on his hands and forearms from barrel contact, extensive bruising across his shoulders and torso, partial hearing loss from sustained exposure to muzzle blast. He would spend 3 weeks in hospital ships, receiving treatment, filing after-action reports that division intelligence officers read with fascination and skepticism in equal measure. His account was corroborated by the Marines who witnessed the aftermath, by the captured Japanese commander who mentioned the engagement in his diary, by the simple physical evidence of 16 destroyed bunkers in close proximity. He would receive the Navy Cross, the nation's second-highest decoration for valor, with a citation noting extraordinary heroism in combat against enemy forces under extremely hazardous conditions. The language was bureaucratic, insufficient to capture the reality of what he had accomplished. But military citations are not poetry. They are documentation of acts that transcend normal human capability, rendered in prose designed for official records rather than emotional resonance. The M2 Browning he employed that day was recovered, refurbished, and returned to service. Weapons, unlike men, do not require recuperation. They need only cleaning, maintenance, replacement of worn parts. This particular gun would fire thousands of additional rounds before war's end, operated by standard crews in conventional employment, effective but unremarkable. It carries no plaque commemorating January 30, 1945. Military equipment rarely memorializes specific engagements. Yet in the collective memory of the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, who advanced up slopes under fire from bunkers identical to the ones destroyed that morning, the story persisted, transmitted through unofficial channels, embellished perhaps, but rooted in documented fact. It became parable and proof simultaneously. Parable about the possibilities inherent in individual excellence, proof that American military effectiveness derived from factors beyond material superiority. Decades after Iwo Jima fell silent, after the island was returned to Japanese administration, after the black volcanic sand absorbed the last traces of battle, historians and veterans would debate the engagement's significance. Some viewed it as an anomaly, a confluence of individual capability, favorable circumstances, and enemy defenders perhaps less effective than typical Japanese troops. Others saw it as exemplar, proof that American training philosophy, which emphasized individual initiative and adaptability, produced soldiers capable of extraordinary effectiveness when circumstances demanded deviation from doctrine. The truth, perhaps, encompasses both interpretations. The Marine who destroyed 16 bunkers in 30 minutes was certainly exceptional, physically strong, tactically brilliant, psychologically resilient beyond normal parameters. But his exceptionalism was cultivated by training systems, supported by logistics that delivered the weapon and ammunition necessary for such an engagement, and enabled by a military culture that did not punish deviation from doctrine when circumstances justified alternative approaches. The M2 Browning itself represents a specifically American approach to military technology, weapons designed for reliability and effectiveness under field conditions, manufactured with tolerances that permit battlefield maintenance, deployed in quantities that ensure availability. Japanese forces, operating under severe material constraints by 1945, could not expend ammunition at rates the Marines' engagement required. Their defensive philosophy emphasized conservation, measured fire, making every round count because, logistical realities meant replacement was uncertain. The Marine fired over 1,500 rounds in 30 minutes because American logistics ensured those rounds were available, because doctrine permitted such expenditure when tactical circumstances justified it, because the industrial base producing ammunition operated at a scale Japanese planning had not fully comprehended when war began. Material abundance alone does not win wars, but material abundance combined with tactical flexibility and individual excellence creates military capabilities that adversaries struggle to counter. On quiet nights, decades after the event, the Marine would sometimes describe those 30 minutes to close friends or visiting historians. His accounts were factual, emotionally restrained, focused on technical details rather than personal feelings. He spoke of angles and reloads, of identifying weak points in bunker construction, of the methodical process of destroying prepared positions. He did not describe himself as heroic. He described a problem, 16 bunkers killing Marines, and a solution he implemented with available tools and whatever capabilities he possessed. This framing, problem and solution rather than heroism and glory, reflects a particularly American pragmatism about warfare. The objective was not glorious death or spiritual transcendence through sacrifice. The objective was destroying enemy positions so that fellow Marines could advance with fewer casualties. The method was whatever worked. Doctrine be damned if circumstances suggested better alternatives. The Japanese soldiers who died in those bunkers were, by accounts from prisoners and captured documents, largely experienced troops, veterans of campaigns in China and the Pacific. They had fought well at Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian. They had inflicted horrific casualties on American forces through defensive tactics that maximized the advantages of prepared positions and interior lines. And on Iwo Jima, they faced an adversary who simply refused to accept the tactical realities their defensive preparations assumed. This was not bravery as they understood it, collective sacrifice in service to emperor and nation. This was something alien to their military culture, an individual deciding that rules and expectations were negotiable, that a two-man weapon could be operated by one man, that 16 bunkers could fall in half an hour if someone was willing to pay the physical price. They died confused, perhaps, at the last, confused that their impregnable defenses were proving quite penetrable, confused that the Americans, they had been told, were spiritually weak and individually cowardly, were demonstrating neither weakness nor cowardice, confused that the war they had entered with confidence of ultimate victory was revealing itself as fundamentally unwinnable. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, black and fine and pervasive, has buried much of the battle's physical evidence. The bunkers, or what remains of them, sit silent now, stabilized by Japanese authorities as historical sites, visited by tourists who walk battlefields emptied of violence but still heavy with memory. The M2 Browning has been retired from that particular serial number, replaced by newer versions with improved components, though the fundamental design remains John Browning's century-old conception. The Marine himself has passed, his obituary noting military service, but unable to capture the essential reality of those 30 minutes when one man redefined possible. And yet the engagement persists in collective memory, taught in military academies as case study in individual initiative, referenced in tactical manuals discussing crew-served weapon employment, preserved in official records and unofficial stories passed among Marines who understand that doctrine is guideline rather than law when circumstances demand excellence beyond normal parameters. In the end, perhaps, the engagement signifies most powerfully not what happened, but what it revealed about competing philosophies of warfare. The Japanese approach, meticulous defensive preparation, collective sacrifice, strategic patience designed to inflict unsustainable casualties, was tactically brilliant but strategically flawed because it assumed adversaries would accept the calculus it imposed. The American approach, material abundance, tactical flexibility, culture permitting individual initiative, proved more adaptable because it did not require adversaries to cooperate with preconceived assumptions about how battles should unfold. When 16 bunkers fell in 30 minutes to one Marine with a two-man weapon, it was not merely a tactical victory. It was proof that warfare is ultimately contest between wills and capabilities, and that rigidity, however well prepared, fractures when struck by adaptability it cannot anticipate. The sun that rose over Iwo Jima on January 30, 1945, illuminated a battlefield where two fundamentally different conceptions of military effectiveness collided with absolute clarity. One conception emphasized collective strength, accepted limits, defensive patience. The other emphasized individual excellence, rejected constraints, offensive audacity. The engagement's outcome suggested which philosophy, under the specific conditions of industrialized warfare between powers of asymmetric capacity, would prove more effective. This is not moral judgment. Both sides fought with courage. Both sides suffered grievously. But one side's courage was channeled through a system that could produce Marines capable of destroying 16 bunkers alone, while the other side's courage was constrained by a system that could not adapt when foundational assumptions proved incorrect. And in that difference, perhaps, lies the engagement's enduring lesson. Excellence without adaptability is brittle, and no defense, however well prepared, can withstand offenses that refuse to accept its premises. The volcanic ash continues its patient work, burying history beneath layers of geological time. But memory, that most human of preservatives, resists burial. The story endures. One Marine, one weapon, 30 minutes, 16 bunkers, as testament to what becomes possible when training, technology, and individual will converge in circumstances demanding the extraordinary. It endures as reminder that warfare, stripped of romance and ideology, is ultimately problem-solving under lethal conditions. And the side that solves problems faster, more creatively, more effectively, prevails regardless of spiritual fervor or tactical orthodoxy. And it endures, perhaps most importantly, as proof that